We are about to dive into one of the most dramatic, turbulent, and just incredible stories of how a nation is born. This is the story of how modern Ireland was forged in the fire of the 20th century. So, to really get it, you have to picture this. It's 1912, and Ireland is completely part of the United Kingdom, a key piece of the massive British Empire. For almost everyone, this seemed like a fact of life, something that was set in stone.
But then, you jump forward just one decade, only 10 years, to 1922, and everything has changed. The map itself has been violently redrawn. Ireland has its independence, which is radical, but it's a nation that is literally tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war.
So you have to ask, how on earth did that happen? How does part of the most powerful empire in the world go from a pretty straightforward political debate to an all-out revolution and then a civil war, all in the span of just 10 years?
Okay, let's get into it. It all starts with the one crisis that basically lit the fuse for everything that came after, the huge, explosive fight over something called Home Rule.
Now, on the surface, the idea was pretty simple. Ireland would get to govern itself on local matters but would still be part of the UK. But the reaction? Whoa, it was explosive. On one side, nationalists who wanted to really assert their Irish identity formed their own militia to make sure it happened. On the other side, you had Unionists who were fiercely loyal to Britain and were terrified that Home Rule would become Rome Rule, meaning dominated by the Catholic Church. So they formed their own armed militia to stop it, by force. And suddenly, for the very first time, the idea of just splitting the island in two, partition, was on the table as a real solution.
And then, World War I breaks out, and it just changes the whole game. The Home Rule debate gets put on ice, but in doing that, it radicalized Irish politics in a way that nobody saw coming.
And these two images, man, they just say it all. On the left, you've got the mainstream guy, John Redmond, telling Irishmen to go fight for Britain, hoping they'd be rewarded with Home Rule later. But on the right, you've got guys like Daniel Breen, a wanted man, a rebel, who represented this new, younger generation that wanted Britain out, period.
So what happens next is this incredible rapid-fire chain reaction. It's like dominoes falling. In 1916, a tiny rebellion in Dublin gets crushed. But then, the British response is so harsh, they execute the leaders, that it creates this massive wave of public sympathy for the rebels. This directly fuels a landslide election win for the radical Sinn Féin party. And what do? They declare a completely independent Irish Republic, which of course kicks off a brutal guerrilla war.
So after years of this terrible fighting, a truce is finally called. Britain comes to the negotiating table. It looks like the war is over. But the peace treaty they offered, well, it would end one war only to start another, much more tragic one. A war of brother against brother.
And this guy right here, this is Michael Collins. He was the mastermind of the guerrilla war, and now he's in London, leading the Irish negotiating team. I mean, just imagine the pressure. He's facing the heavyweights of the British Empire, people like David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, who basically threatened him with immediate and terrible war if he didn't sign a deal.
And this table just perfectly lays out the impossible choice they were facing. The treaty gave them a new Irish Free State, with its own army, its own finances, a level of freedom that was way beyond what Home Rule ever offered. But, and this is a huge but, it wasn't the completely independent 32-county republic they had fought and died for. It meant swearing an oath to the British king, and it made the partition of Ireland official.
Back in the Irish Parliament, the Dáil, the debate was agonizing. And the vote? It was just painfully close. 64 voted yes to accept the treaty, and 57 voted no. The fate of an entire nation was decided by just 7 votes. And that razor-thin margin, it was going to have catastrophic consequences. Because that vote, it split the country right down the middle and led directly to the Irish Civil War. The very same people who had been comrades, who had fought side by side against the British, now turned their guns on each other. It was a conflict that would leave scars for generations.
So, the pro-treaty side eventually wins the war. But what they inherit is a nation that's just deeply traumatized. And now they've got this enormous challenge of building a functioning country literally from the ashes of not one, but 2 back-to-back wars.
And just because the war was over, it didn't mean the bitterness just vanished. The politics of the 1930s were still really violent. You had pro-treaty army veterans forming this group called the Blue Shirts, who were clashing in the streets with their old enemies in the anti-treaty IRA.
But here's the amazing thing. Amidst all that chaos, the really vital, kind of unglamorous work of actually building a country began. They did stuff like create a new, unarmed police force. They built huge infrastructure projects, like a massive hydroelectric dam to power the country. And they somehow managed to balance the national budget.
Now, here comes this amazing political twist. In 1932, the leader of the side that lost the Civil War, Eamon de Valera, he comes to power peacefully through an election, and his government then spends the next several years taking apart the very treaty he hated, piece by piece, until finally in 1937 they introduce this new constitution that basically makes Ireland a republic in everything but name.
All right, so let's fast forward to the 1950s. By this point, political independence is pretty much a done deal. But now Ireland is facing a completely new kind of threat. Not from an army, but from total economic collapse.
I mean, just look at these numbers. While the rest of Europe is having this huge post-war economic boom, Ireland is just stuck. The economy is barely growing, and about 50,000 people are leaving every single year just to find work. That's like a whole town emptying out year after year. The population hits an all-time low. It really looked like the revolution was failing.
But then, a new generation of leaders steps up, and they're embodied by this guy, Sean Lemis. And what's so powerful about him is that he was a veteran of the 1916 Rising. He'd fought for political freedom, and he was the one who realized, hey, what's the point of having our own country if all of our people have to leave it to make a living?
So what did they do? Well, Lemas and his team basically took the old economic playbook and tore it up. They dropped all the old protectionist policies, they rolled out the red carpet for foreign companies to come to Ireland, and they invested a ton in new infrastructure and, crucially, free education. It was a complete 180-degree turn.
And you can see from this quote, for Lemas, this wasn't just about economics. This was the final decisive battle of the revolution itself. He knew that after all the sacrifice, all the bloodshed, from the Home Rule fights to the Civil War, the entire Irish experiment would ultimately be judged on one simple thing. Could it build a prosperous nation where its own people actually wanted to live? It was the question that defined the first 50 years of the state, and honestly, it's a question Ireland is still answering today.